Greetings, and welcome to Theology Roundtable, a summary of the week's events analyzed through the specific lens of theology. I'm your host, Vincent Rocchio, and with me today from Duke University, author of Waiting for Godot in Sarajevo, is David Toole. From Southern Methodist University, author of Truth Telling in a Post-Truth World, Stephen Long. And from St. Thomas University in St. Paul, Minnesota, author of The Lynching of George Floyd, Black Theology, Protest, and Racial Justice in the Law Review, and author of several other articles in the Canopy Forum, Marguerite Hattouni Spencer. Welcome, everybody. Today I want to begin with a discussion of a news item that, a couple of media outlets picked up, and that is the fact that the 45th President of the United States was indicted in a Manhattan district court this week. Preliminary reports show an increase in both popularity and fundraising as a result of this event. So I wanted to start with Stephen and ask, isn't that increase in popularity and funding a rather stark symptom that we are indeed living in a post-truth society?
Yes, thank you, Vincent. Delighted to be here. I would say it is, and it's not my place to decide the worthiness of the indictment, of course, but it seems to me that one of the downsides of the indictment, which you see in the support for the former president, is that it treats Trump too often like a unique individual, which of course he is. I don't mean to deny that, and avoids the fact that he's a symptom of a deeper problem. And the deeper problem is precisely this loss of the ability to tell the truth. In particular, I think, among certain groups of people, politicians, business persons, and others, for whom a kind of instrumental rationality has taken over, so that achieving an end, whether it's an honorable end or not, is a good in itself. And in that sense, what you see in the Trump indictment and the increased support for him is that no press is bad press for him. So that no matter what, although a number of people think at some point people are going to recognize the difficulties with having elected a con man and a grifter who can't tell the truth, that's probably not going to happen until we have more structural changes, more places where the virtue of truth-telling can emerge. And that's my main concern about our current post-truth culture. We have data, we have constant polling, we have ceaseless accounts of what went wrong, of where people are. We send and the media, of course, is just absolutely fascinated with Trump because he sells things so well. But what we don't have, I think, is an analysis of a post-truth culture. And I don't want to suggest that somehow we were all telling the truth prior to 1950s or 1940s. I mean, this is a very long history in America, right? I think it goes back to the Slavocracy and the difficulty we have in naming and identifying our history as it is. It goes back to D.W. Griffin and The Birth of a Nation, that racist film which tried to explain who we are. So it's a repetition. It's a repetition, but has infected so deeply our political structure that it's almost like we're in the Matrix and we can't get out of it.
Well, how do we square the circle, though? Because if I understand what you're saying correctly, um, as a society, as a culture, we're a little more fond of the ends justifies the means. How do we square that with any kind of Christian theology?
I don't think you can. And one of the real disappointments in the Trump event, of course, is the complicity of the Christian churches, especially the evangelical churches, but not them alone. The mainline Protestants didn't support him as much, but they did, and Roman Catholics supported him as well. for a variety of reasons. Um, um, so I think this is a failure of church life as well, a failure of church life that suggests that there are purposes, goods, ends that require a particular kind of means, and just amassing power and trying to sort of force your will upon the populace, which has become our politics, which is really a post-political reality. What we've lost are places where you have to deliberate over goods. What constitutes the goods? What's a rational desire that we should pursue? And my own sense is we'll never have a politics, or even a politics closely. And truth is tricky. I understand truth is tricky. When you find yourself saying what is truth, standing with Rudy Giuliani or Pontius Pilate, you might want to raise some questions about it. But truth nonetheless is tricky. And I think until we sort of stitch up the idea that politics is about the deliberation over what constitutes goods, and good is always going to be related to the question of truth, I don't think we're going to make much progress. The church should be a place where you can have those difficult conversations. It shouldn't be afraid of contestation. It shouldn't be afraid of conflict. But in fact, unfortunately, I think management defines our politics rather than actually politics.
I was just going to jump in quickly. I mean, you're the media scholar, not me, but in the question of post-truth in this particular context, 2016 at least to now, I've just been thinking recently of the fact sometimes we feel like this is a new phenomenon, and particularly in the mainstream media, and it's not. So I was thinking of the case of Ida B. Wells in the 1880s and 90s, where the mainstream newspapers had a particular narrative about lynchings, and about the reason that they were occurring relative to the crimes of Black men, and Ida B. Wells as a contrary news. I mean, really a different way of being a journalist and trying to get at the truth, was able to start publishing stories that in fact showed that what the mainstream newspapers were really producing as objective news. I mean, they were racist, but they didn't, present themselves that way or weren't seen that way. And she was able to challenge that by really chasing the truth and saying, no, it's this. And of course, then they burned down her newspaper and right. So that was in the 1880s and 90s. So what's been going on in the media that then brings us to a show like this, where this is the topic of the week, it seems to me, is an old story in the United States, and you just have to keep trudging along, like Ida B. Wells was, however many years, 130 years ago, and pursue the truth despite the fact that it's contested, and oftentimes, especially now in the way the mainstream media works, it's often hard to even know what it means.
I mean, it seems to me that this is like an epistemological crisis. What are our sources of truth? And Hannah Arendt wrote a lot about defactualization, around the time of Watergate and so on. And she said it wasn't so much an appeal to emotion, but to, at that time at least, appeal of kind of over-rationalizations with statistics and data, which brings up the question, where do these statistics or data come from? But I also think, I think Carl Sagan said, if we continue down this route, if we can't discern truth from fact, we're going to be, slipping into this superstition and darkness that we left behind in the Middle Ages, purportedly. But there's another, I don't know if you're Timothy Snyder, he's an historian, and he said, I guess you would say, post-truth is pre-fascism, which is a bit of what we see. But he makes another claim. He says, without the ability to tell the truth or find out facts, we can't really form a civil society. And I think that's what we're experiencing as well. And then you could simply start slipping into discussions of public discourse and our inability to carry on, honest public discourse. So that's kind of the direction I was thinking when we started. This epistemological crisis, I think we're going through that, just kind of in a different way than, the onset of modernity.
Well, and I'm curious as to whether another story that happened on Tuesday sort of evidences this epistemological crisis. In a court in Montana on Tuesday, a judge upheld the rights of Native Americans to sue the state of Montana for not upholding Native American history and culture to be taught in the public schools. Now, what is so noteworthy about this story, several states within the United States have a mandate for the public schools to teach Native American history and culture. What's unique about Montana, and David, you probably know this, is that this mandate to teach Native American history and culture is enshrined in the state of Montana's constitution. It's not just an educational mandate, it is part of Montana's state constitution and has been for 50 years, which is, happened before David and I were born, certainly. So it might be tough for us 35-year-olds to speak of it. But what's kind of notable for something that's within the state's constitution, the Attorney General argued to the court that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And I was just kind of wondering, Marguerite, I know you don't have, every case history in the United States memorized, but have you heard this as a legal strategy before? This, argument about leading a horse to water?
Actually, no. It seems very cavalier, just using Montana language. But the Constitution was amended they created a new one in 1972, and that's when it was brought to their attention that there was this failure not only to emphasize the Native American cultural identity, but to work carefully with the tribes. And so it was, to me, it seems like a capitulation to this, I guess, desire to frame, kind of going back to the same thing. Let's just frame it the way we want to frame it. It's like talking to my children who, it's not pound feet, it's foot pound. I think there's this notion that whatever I say, whatever I do, I can say it and do it. And that's the cavalier element. Well, of course, we don't have to enforce our Constitution. But it really was an issue of enforcement and working with the indigenous peoples and a lack of oversight from the Office of Public, I think that's OPI, and then a lack of accountability, a lack of, I don't know if you read some of the details, but if you have money to spend.
Well, yeah, I did. And so, I think it's more important than a legal proceeding going on here. I wanted to quote one more person involved in this case, and that's Shauna Yellowkidney, who's a citizen of the Blackfoot tribe and a mother of three. And this is what she had to say. We have ways of knowing that are different from the white community, and they're powerful and they're beautiful. And that would benefit my girls with every step of their education by being able to share that with their classmates. The beauty and the power of indigenous tribes here in Montana, what they once stood for and what they still stand for today. And so I was wondering, David, we've been talking a little about an epistemological crisis. Is what's going on with Native Americans today part of overcoming an epistemological crisis? And isn't it distinctly possible that we can learn from this process?
Yes, probably on both counts. I think, this is such an interesting story for me in so many ways, not least because I'm from Montana, but also in the summer of 2021, given your last quote, I spent some time on with the Blackfoot people on the Blackfeet Reservation on some of these issues. But the first thing that comes to mind to set this in a wider context, well, first, let me just give you the line from the Montana Constitution, which was completely rewritten in 1972. The previous constitution went back to statehood in the 1880s, and And my uncle actually was a member of the Constitutional Convention. And the line is straightforward. It says the state recognizes as the distinct and unique cultural heritage of the American Indians and is committed in its educational goals to the preservation of their cultural identity. Now, one of the first things that comes to mind when I see that line in the Constitution, and I think of the reality of education around indigenous cultures in Montana's school systems, is actually not a Montana story, but a Navajo story on the Navajo reservation. So about 5 years ago, I taught a class at Duke called Ethics in Native America, American Indian Life and Literature. And I did it because Duke is really weak on anything to do with Native American studies. UNC right next door is strong. Duke's weak. We don't have much. So I decided to just float a course called Ethics in Native America. I had 2 young Navajo women in the class, straight from the reservation, both freshmen. And they had gone to high schools on the Navajo reservation. So now we're not even talking in sort of Arizona or New Mexico in general, but on the reservation. They had never been introduced to any Native American literature. Everything that we read in that class was new to them. And they were, it was sad. I mean, for them, for us, they were fantastic presences in the class, but it really showed you like they grew up on the Navajo reservation and didn't get anything that they were getting at Duke in a class taught by a white guy who was only doing it because nobody else was doing it. And so certainly that phenomenon is going on in Montana. And the other story that comes to mind, and again, it involves the Blackfoot specifically, is one of the most prominent Native American authors is, unfortunately, he died too young, is a man named James Welch, who was a member of the Blackfoot tribe. And he published a novel in 1986 called Fool's Crow, which was an attempt to really show the beauty of that culture at sort of the early moments of its disintegration because of white encroachment and white settlers, 1868 to 1870. And that novel was actually taken off of the shelves in many of the, well, I don't know what many, in several of the school districts in Montana, where actually the school boards censored it and took it off the shelves on their grounds that it was too violent and it exposed the students to things that they shouldn't learn. The reality is it was a real attempt to actually show, as the quote you just read suggested, the beauty of a culture at a time when it was beginning to be destroyed. And so that's sort of the larger background. And then the other thing I'd say in terms of your question about the epistemological crisis is, yeah, I mean, the Blackfeet, I mean, that's a Blackfoot phrase, a way of knowing. I mean, they really do think of their own traditions as a way of knowing. And one of the things they will tell you is that they've never lost that though they've lost a lot, that they've never actually lost the foundations of their own epistemology. And indeed, they're in the midst of really strong moments of cultural recovery right now. And this court case would suggest getting a little aid from the state to actually do that. So, but Montana now is a red state with a supermajority in the legislature, with a Republican attorney general, a Republican governor, and it's not a surprise at all that this attorney general's office took that position.
I think it's fascinating to watch that the reactionary forces at present have this deep fear of history, and to ask ourselves, why is remembrance so dangerous? And maybe it's because we don't have a way to remember, especially our tainted past, in a way that won't destroy us. So St. Augustine begins Confessions by saying, "For love of your love, I will retrace my wicked ways." So he can look at who he is in all honesty and truth. This is also a question of truth, courageously, precisely because he knows that looking at the past will not destroy and undo him. And it seems to me that the concerns about critical race theory, the concerns about indigenous history, the concerns about telling the truth about Reconstruction and the Slavocracy, the concerns about telling the truth about ourselves, right? Not just them, but all of us. And we're getting ready for we're in Holy Week. Christians are a people who live from anamnesis, from remembrance. So if we lose this ability to remember, to tell our history about ourselves, we're going to lose a significant account of what it means to be a person of faith.
Well, Steve, I can build on that. In book 7 of his Confessions, one of my favorite lines. This might say a little bit of how I see the world, but he's obviously he's talking to God. But it was in book 7 where he maybe it's he acknowledges that God takes him from behind his own back and pulls him in front of himself so that he can see how vile and twisted and ugly he was, right? And I think that's I don't know what we're going through right now, but maybe it was George Floyd's, lynching that, okay, we've got to be taken out from behind ourselves where we're hiding. Here's the stark reality of who we are, so we can see how vile and twisted and ugly we are. And it's kind of that moment. Also, the act, the Indian Education for All Act, has this clause that what we're supposed to be doing in Montana is to respond in a culturally responsive manner. And I think what is that? We're afraid of critical race theory, and that's what is a culturally responsive manner to deal with, how we preserve their culture. But I think Augustine really is a helpful tool. Now, maybe not in the general public, but it is one of the classics, Tale of Two Cities, Augustine's Confessions. But I do think we prefer to hide ourselves behind our own backs. It's just sort of unnatural.
I'm just wondering if what we're hiding from is a fear of a sacred world. That seems to be a kind of recurring theme in all of this. And David, it seems to me that as Native Americans, try and recover their past, what they're doing is a process of resacralization, and dominant mainstream American culture seems very afraid of a sacred world, and I'm wondering what that fear is all about.
I mean, I think I'd answer that sort of yes and no, in the sense that in some cases I think that's maybe a broad cultural answer, but I live in the South now, and the South is full of Christians still, and I don't think they're afraid of a sacralized world. They may be afraid of a sacralized world if it has to look like a Blackfoot world, but they're not afraid of that. What they're afraid of is losing power and control. And so I think that it has a whole lot more to do. I mean, this whole issue of being afraid of the past, taking out critical race theory, changing the way we can teach elementary students the kind of things that are happening in Florida, or for that matter in Florida now, the things that in House Bill 999 are actually, has passed, and I'm not sure where it stands in the Senate, but if it passes the Senate and DeSantis signs it, I mean, it literally takes DEI out of the university environment in Florida. And in fact, and interestingly, in Florida, there's 40 sitting presidents at Florida state universities, and none of them, not a single one, have spoken out against what DeSantis is doing. And so when I look at that, I don't think it's a fear of a desacralized world. I think it's just a fear of losing power. If in fact the narratives that we need to remember and bring forward would do that. I mean, since Reconstruction came up very quickly, I mean, I was shocked relatively. I mean, if you live in the South and you're not from here, it takes a long time to let yourself sink in and learn. And I was just surprised when I found out recently that in those first few years of Reconstruction, the legislature in South Carolina was dominantly Black. That the University of South Carolina was a predominantly Black institution. And in fact, the whites in South Carolina were a minority in terms of governance, in terms of the way the university system ran. And it was working quite well because actually the Blacks who were in power were actually advocating openness in the university, for example, to whites as well, right? So they were trying to broaden the things, and the answer of, it didn't last long. I mean, I think less than a decade before, people started being killed and intimidation came up, and we started losing those sort of glory moments. But that's like a shocking thing, and it was a power change, a gigantic power change. And in Wilmington, in North Carolina, the same thing. 1898, a duly elected biracial government was unsuited in America's only successful coup d'état that included the burning down of black businesses and a massacre in the streets in 1898. Right. So I think it's about power and control. And from a Christian perspective, this gets a little tricky, right? Because where do Christians stand relative to the United States on, or even our local communities, on whether or not we think our job is to be the folks who are trying to stay in power and control?
I find that very helpful, David. And David and I were both trained in a kind of non-Constantinian Christianity, which gets a lot of criticisms, and it's not without its fault. I understand that. But at this moment, when you see the rise of Christian nationalism and, of all things, Catholic integralism, who saw that reemerging? When you see the rise of this idea that we're under siege, primarily it's kind of a white Christian grievance. We're under siege. These forces are taking away the way we think about the world. They don't understand us. When you have that sort of approach, then you think that it's your task to seize the reins of power, even I think in the way that January 6th tried to do, and it really literally seize the reins of power. And if there's anything that the church needs to do right now, it is simply, I think, to take more seriously Good Friday and to recognize this is what power looks like. This is an enthronement, if you will. And if we don't do that, if we keep up with this Constantinian Christianity, I think we're going to lose generations in the churches, because you see young people fleeing it. I don't know why, and I know there's a lot of reasons, but I find this desire, and constantly this idea that we have to understand these people who feel aggrieved. Well, I grew up with them. I think I do understand them, and there's one thing, I guess, to understand, but there's another try to understand so that you'll sort of legitimate. And I think we have to offer a counter narrative. We have to begin to say there's another kind of Christianity that's quite okay and survives quite well, without thinking that it's our task to impose our way of life from state sources.
Well, I want to follow up with that, Steve, because I think there was a group that is trying to push back. A coalition of Catholic nuns on Friday issued a statement, which is a very interesting choice on their part. Fans of the West Wing will know that when organizations issue a statement on Friday is called Take Out the Trash Day. So usually you do that when you want to be ignored. But I think this group of nuns was kind of politically savvy. They recognized that if they tried to put it forward in this week, they were really going to get drowned out. But essentially, what's so important about their statement is that they released a public letter voicing support for the LGBTQ plus community. And this is kind of pushback against an earlier statement that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops made to discourage Catholic hospitals from doing any kind of procedures, gender affirming procedures. So this is really pushback against it, but there's something in this pushback that is really worth noting. And here I want to quote. They said, as members of the body of Christ, we cannot be whole without the full inclusion of transgender, non-binary, and gender-expansive individuals. Now, it seems to me that that is a kind of, pre-Constantinian view of Christianity, that the mandate here is to welcome into and see as part of the body of Christ everybody that is marginalized. And kind of along the lines that you were talking, Stephen, there's a very different sense of power in the Christian epistemology. So I was just wondering, Marguerite, your take on this affirmation of the LGBTQ plus community from women that are part of the institutional church.
The image of Christ as one body and many members is a very strong call for unity. But at the same time, with Genesis 1:27 being created in God's image, there's also a strong call for community because everyone is worthy of dignity, right? And what we do needs to be like what God does. And it also strikes us that we need to be images of God. So you could see that taking you in different directions, either encompassing all, because they're all with dignity, or kind of embracing the, I guess, notion that we are, the natural law approach to what it needs to be human. So with the natural law approach, it isn't inclusive. It is very biologistic. And that's where you get the doctrinal note that the bishops promulgated because they believe in this unity, of body and soul. And the way we are wired in terms of our sexual identity, we can't tamper with. So we have these competing notions of, yes, we're all worthy of dignity and we're all one body of Christ. And then this sort of narrowing down of the Catholic Church's arguments into that sort of biologistic space. And so what I think what the nuns, like the nuns on the bus, right? They're challenging the more narrow interpretation, the biologistic interpretation that the church often brings forward, whether it's in this space or, gay and lesbian marriage, et cetera, or integrate, what am I trying to say? Artificial forms of family planning, abortion. So the fact that they're women challenging a biologistic notion of what it means to be human, that of course emphasizes standardization, is very interesting. And I think what they're, it's kind of riding on the back of, I don't know if you heard that the Pope, the Vatican, has just repudiated the doctrine of discovery. And I read something, one of the organizations that helps Catholics, New Ways Ministry, so this is actually, we can read these two events together. We can say this repudiation of the doctrine of discovery and building on, I think Pope in 2016, Pope Francis said, we're on the verge of apologizing, for what we've done for the, to or with the LGBTQ plus community. And so that could be kind of a model about where we're possibly heading, where we could see some greater solidarity. But good, as they'd say down under, good on you, nuns, right? For, and I think always women and women scholars. Or James Cone, if you begin from experience, you're going to be shunned by the institution where, the male scholars will say, we want objectivity. I don't want natural law objectivity here. So they're always brave, the women of the church.
Yeah, well, I'd like to give one more quote before I throw it over to everybody else that I think demonstrates the difference between women's religious orders and men's religious orders. Part of their letter states, "We will remain oppressors. We, the women's religious congregations, will remain oppressors until we, as vowed Catholic religious, acknowledge the existence of LGBTQ plus people in our own congregations. We seek to cultivate a faith community where all, especially our transgender, non-binary, and gender-expansive siblings, experience a deep belonging." So I'd like to throw that over to everyone else on the panel just by saying I personally do not know of any male religious order who has publicly and explicitly stated that, yes, LGBTQ plus people are a member of our communities and they belong and are treasured. As well as just that statement about the sense of deep belonging as being a sort of central tenet to Christian community.
Let me just jump in real quick and then see what Steve has to say. I just wanted to make the connection between that, which is all great, and I love the way that they leverage the body of Christ to make the argument. But everything we were talking about earlier, relative to from the top of the show to now, relative to what's going on in conservative politics in America, aligns perfectly with those natural law, even among non-Catholics, right? I mean, this is from the LGBTQ plus community in terms of how they show up to conservatives generally in America. That's the problem, right? It's a violation of the way that human beings are supposed to be set up. And it's not just the Catholics who say that. And so I just wanted to point that out, that there is an alignment with a lot of non-Catholic things going on here. And it's great that as a Catholic, maybe a wayward Catholic, but a Catholic, I love the fact that the nuns have taken this position. And I also just wanted to say, to go back just for a moment to the Blackfoot question, one of the difficulties of how to think about what the Blackfoot are doing and the way in which they're engaging Montana is that they don't necessarily want to do that alongside the church. And so one of the things that one of their elders pointed out to me when I was on the reservation in the summer of 21 was that Browning, Montana, which is the center of the reservation, it's a small town. I don't know what the population is, a few thousand. It's a small town. They have 36 different churches. And from the perspective of the traditionalists, and he was a traditionalist, they don't want anything to do with any of those churches because all of those churches were complicit in what happened to us. Now, at the same time, of course, there are Catholic Blackfoot people who are members of the Catholic Church on the reservation who would take a different view. So I just wanted to get that on the table before we forget it. But I'll shut up, let Steve pipe in on the LGBTQ matter.
As a Protestant, I say God love the nuns. I mean, they often come through in a way that few others do in the Catholic Church and give me a sense of hope. And I'm not exactly sure how to explain that. I do think this discussion of nature that has arisen is important because I have been deeply influenced by a Jesuit, Henri de Lubac, who taught, and it kind of led to Vatican II, that all human beings are created with a natural desire for God. I find this fascinating, and I find it even more politically radical, perhaps, than de Lubac himself would have. And I think it's really interesting. At the same time, you get some reactionary forces. They often come from an older teaching in Catholicism called the doctrine of pure nature, that God could have created us with a pure nature so that a purely natural end would satisfy us. And you can't separate this sort of account of purely natural end from questions of gender, sexuality, and all of the discussion today. One reason it's come back is because it says, we know how people are supposed to have sex, and this is how they're supposed to have sex according to nature. If you emphasize this idea that we all have a natural desire for God, I was sitting in an airport, and I hate airports. I find them incredibly annoying. And I was sitting in an airport and actually reading about this, because I always read in an airport so I don't have to have conversations. And all of a sudden I had this kind of epiphany. I really, really looked at the people passing by. In all of their oddness, no one looked the same. Everyone created in the image of God, different, all with a kind of longing, a desire, and I would say, I don't mean to be sort of impose this on everyone, but a desire for God that also finds itself in a desire for community. And if you begin to see this, then you can see people, I think, anew. From within the Christian perspective, you can see people anew. All of these people, even they all have, everyone has this desire. And our question is, how do we learn from their desire, from their longing, which is going to differ from us? We don't have to impose ours on theirs. We can learn from it, even for those who are outside the church. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful to my Catholic education, such as it is. It must have not been very good because I didn't quite finally swim the Tiber. I thought about it. But alas, I'm stuck with the Methodists. So
have 2 points. See, the first point, which is really sort of a latter point, is I think the youth, if you teach the young kids, the freshmen, they have that longing for something. They may not admit it, but so many of them are turned off by, in a Catholic setting, the Catholic Church. And so what I try to say, well, try to find some underlying truth values here. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's some kind of strong sense of where we head. What I know that because they're so frustrated with the divisive nature of society. They are going through a very difficult time, having been COVIDed, and then have this divisiveness. But the other was to your airport epiphany happened. I had a similar one that happened after I gave birth to my first child, right? And it was like, oh my gosh, this is a miracle. How amazing, how beautiful, how strong my love is. And then I looked around and everybody was born. and so it's really actually pedestrian, right? That you have this unique human being. And then you start thinking, well, like you, Steve, everyone's worthy, everyone's unique, and we should celebrate all that. So it's just this weird juxtaposition. So it was in the birth room, not the airport, but that same beauty of everyone. And I have 6 children, and 2 of them are gay, and it's there she is. If we could all feel that way, wherever that epiphany happens, and I think the nuns just get that, and I'm not saying because they're women, or they just have the guts, or have the ability to see. Back to what can we see, what can we perceive.
So Steve, I have a question for Steve. I love that's connected to the airport epiphany. This idea of a sort of natural longing for God, if you put it in the context of LGBTQ plus, could you say then, it seems to be what you in effect saying that would fit then with what the nuns are saying, is that when a young person is feeling like they're in the wrong body in a sense, and they're ultimately work toward gender reassignment, are they just really would you be willing to say that could well just be an expression of a longing for God? I mean, if the body of Christ is in fact only whole insofar as we can make everything as expansive as possible as human beings, and this is a road that not enough people have gone down because they've been oppressed, that's actually what's happening?
I think it's possible. And in fact, that's how I would put it. A mutual friend of ours, Scott Bader Say, has written beautifully on this very question. And he sees it along those lines. Now, of course, we don't want to then legitimate every desire, because there are desires that go bad. There are desires that get malformed. Now, I think the malformed desires are primarily found on Wall Street, not among trans people. But so I don't want to say, but I think we have the fruits of the Spirit. We have the gifts, the Beatitudes. We can use those as a way to determine and discern. And if you know people who are trans, or like Marguerite, I have a son who came out, they're not doing this because of the rate of return on their investment, right? I mean, it's not like an instrumental reasoning. It's not like I said. I mean, there are criticisms of this that say, well, in the modern era, the will predominates, and these are just people who are so willful that they're imposing their will upon the biological form of their life. That's just nonsense. Nonsense. If you've dealt with any of these persons, you know that that's not what they're dealing with. And I also don't mean to romanticize them. I mean, I've been in gay and lesbian cultures and straight cultures, all of them have issues. Some of the issues are similar, So I don't want to say that just because someone has a desire, it's legitimate. The desires do have to be ordered and directed and formed, but it's really odd to me that we decide some desires can't be properly ordered. They can't be properly ordered at all. They can only be extirpated, and I find that deeply, deeply troubling.
I think sometimes, when you're doing the intersection of faith and law, and I know, Vincent, you spoke, what does that mean? And because you can tell lawyer jokes all day long about how can you be a Christian and a lawyer, haha. But I always emphasize, I say to students, okay, let's do math. I mean, what is an integer, right? And they're like, I don't remember. Well, it's the opposite of a fraction. So we emphasize leading an integrated life. So where your faith and your work are integrated so that you're a whole person. And I think, Steve, that's kind of, or David, that desire to lead an integrated life, a whole life, is, I do think, a very spiritual. And I think, Vincent, you said that, like the work of the Holy Spirit, right? Isn't that what you said? You see that in the nuns and their leadership.
I think I would like to end it today with sort of dwelling upon something Stephen touched upon. The thing that always strikes me, and I think it plays out here in the difference between the two documents that the male hierarchy put out and that the nuns put out, is that in so many ways, Christians can see the Beatitudes as their marching orders, and yet there's this institutional church that wants to insist on another set of rules to order our lives and behaviors. And those two don't necessarily see eye to eye. And it seems to me the nuns are coming from the place of the Beatitudes, and likewise the counterpoint is the bishops are coming from, several layers of interpretation that we base rules on instead. And as a result, one comes from a place of power and one comes from a place of trying to identify this deep longing. So I think that's all we have time for today, unfortunately. So I'd like to thank once again our panelists, David Toole, Stephen Long, and Marguerite Hattouni Spencer. And just end this by saying, the sacred is out there. It's our job to find it and listen. David Toole's Waiting for Godot in Sarajevo, Theological Reflections on Nihilism, Tragedy, and Apocalypse is available from Basic Books. Stephen Long's Truth-Telling in a Post-Truth World is available from gbhem.org. Marguerite Hattouni Spencer's The Lynching of George Floyd, Black Theology, Protest, and Racial Justice is available from the Mitchell Hamline Law Review. This has been a Da Vinci Rocchio Media production.